You are listening to WTUZ Radio Podcast. Welcome to WTUZ Radio Podcast. I am your host, Rhonda. And today's podcast, we are going to talk about the transatlantic slave. So the title of this podcast is The Real Transatlantic Slave. Okay, so if this is your first time listening to us, I highly recommend, and I will also drop in this particular podcast links where you can get to the other body of work, specifically who was really in power during the time of the Atlantic slave trade, the companies that were set up to do quote, quote, slave trading and what it was really about. And then also we went into details on how the island of Jamaica dealt with slavery. So this particular podcast, we are going to go into the global transatlantic slave trade. Okay, so let's get into a little bit of technology here. Okay, all right, where are we at? Okay, we are going to... Okay, so this is coming from an article called Convict Transportation from Britain and Ireland, 1650 to 1870. This is coming from an author, Hamish, Maxwell, Stewert. Okay, University of New England out of Australia. Okay, so he did an excellent job with this particular article, and he is an author himself. So let me jump over right quick. I want to give you his body of work, as well as what he used as some of the main sources for this article. So Mr. Maxwell Stewart, notice the last name Stewart, okay? King James Stewart, all right? Okay, just pointing out the surnames. I am not trying to in any way implicate that he is a part of the Stewart bloodline. I am just pointing out the surnames, and we should always start to look at the surnames and know what the origins of those surnames are. So nonetheless, Mr. Maxwell Stewart, his book is Closing Hell's Gates, The Life and Death of a Convict Station. Okay, and then another source that he used pretty heavily in this article that we are about to go through is American Citizens, British Slaves, Yankee Political Prisoners in an Australian Penal Colony, 1839 to 1850. All right, and of course he has other references in this article, but those are some of the main two. Okay, so let's get back to the article. Okay, so again, this article is Convict Transportation from Britain and Ireland, 1615 to 1817. Was it 1870? Okay, so this is by Hamish, Maxwell Stewart. Thank you so much, Mr. Maxwell Stewart. I think you did an excellent job. I have subsequently ordered your book. I cannot wait to get into the details of your book as well. So this is absolutely excellent work. All right. Okay, so let's read the abstract. We're going to go through his article in its entirety. In 1787, the first fleet was dispatched from the British Isles to find a penal settlement at Botany Bay, Australia. Okay, so most people should know that study history, and I pause there to formulate my thoughts. Most people that study history should automatically know that Australia was a prison colony by Britain. It's no secret. It's not hidden. Actually, Australia is a place that I have not visited, but I think I'm going to have to take a trip there. But I know someone that visited Australia, and that was just common knowledge. As a matter of fact, they were in a bar, and one of the Australians pretty much stated, oh, yeah, Australian people are rough people because, this was a prison colony. My folks came over here as a prisoner. This was just common knowledge. Now, this person told me this, 25 something odd years ago. And it's funny how things always stick in your mind. It is no coincidence. It needed to be stuck in my mind for this very time or frequency right now. All right. So by this time, the British government had already experimented with convict transportation for over 160 years. Okay? So they're telling you out the gate that Britain was using a system of, they're calling it transportation, but it was really sending prisoners to different nations, sending them to different places. So as far back, they had already been using this system back in the 1600s. Now, is this a coincidence that it lines up with the said Atlantic slave trade? Absolutely not. All right, so let's continue. All right, the aim of this article is to place the history of transportation to Australia within the content of a wider flow of convict labor from the British Isles in the period 1615 to 1870. So we want to talk about the Atlantic slave trade? So Britain was using convict labor from 1650 to 1870. In the America, they are calling the history of slavery or the 1619 Project. When I told you the real 1619 Project was really Black Europeans coming to America, when we went into detail, and that is documented, Black Europeans coming to America, and the 1619 Kent visitation, where it is documented in Jamaica with Black Europeans being dispatched as convicts / prisoners of war to the island of Jamaica. Let's continue. Using data from a range of sources, it attempts to chart and explain fluctuation in the number of convicts transported over time. It also seeks to explore how the integration of convict labor within the transatlantic market and unfree labor shape British penal policy in the long run. Such an analysis is useful in explaining the differing impacts that transportation had on the prisoners who experienced it and the intensity with which it was opposed in the 19th century by the British anti-slavery movement. So, again, anti-slavery convicts or prisoners are used interchangeably, as well as servant or indentured servitude. Geographically, the article explores these issues in relation to transportation to the New World. Geographically, the article explored these issues in relation to transportation to the New World, especially Barbados, Jamaica, Maryland, and Virginia. West Africa. Wait a minute. Back it up, huh? Back it up. Back it up. What? Yeah. West Africa. New South Wales. Van Diemen's Land, which is Tasmania. Western Australia. Bermuda and Gibraltar. In 1584, Richard Hylek wrote to Elizabeth I to promote the establishment of British settlements on the eastern seaboard of North America. He argued that while Spain and Portugal were poor and barren countries, levels of crime were low because of the wealth generated by their Atlantic possessions. By contrast, he lamented that we and the French are most infamous for our outrageous, common, and daily piracies. The Iberian nations, he pointed out, lacked men rather than the means of employing them. In order to deliver our commonwealth from multitudes of loiterers and idle vagabonds, he argued that offenders should be condemned to service in newfound land and other parts of the Americas where they could be employed in a number of tasks, including sawing and felling timber, manufacturing pitch and tar, mining metals, planting sugarcane, and gathering cotton, whereof there is plenty. So just to refresh, where did he say these folks should go? First of all, who are the folks that was going to do the labor? Commonwealth from the multitude of loiterers and idle vagabonds. They are the offenders, and they should be sentenced for service in the newfound land. Okay, so any lands that they are colonizing and other parts of the Americas where they could be employed in a number of tasks. Okay, so just in case we confuse, if you get thrown off by the cutting down of the timber, manufacturing, and mining metals, he threw up in here what the main two labor points that they tell you they brought the slaves over from Africa. Planting sugarcane and gathering cotton where there is plenty. Okay? Let's continue. While Hakluyt was conspicuous in identifying timber, cotton, and sugarcane as important future New World crops, few attempts were made to provide a legal mechanism for directing convicted felons to England's colonies until after Governor Dale of Virginia appealed for some to be sent to provide desperate needed labor. In response, James I decreed in 1615 that prisoners sent to death who for strength of body or other ability shall be thought fit to be employed in foreign discoveries should be spared on condition of overseas service. Okay? All right. I don't know what happened to my highlights. All right. So I think this is pretty clear. They needed labor in the new colonies, this is at the 1615 mark. But they had to put the laws on the books to pull the prisoners from England, and I'm assuming Scotland and Ireland also. But even if we want to limit it to England. So to pull prisoners from England, and their sentence is they are supposed to go labor in the newfound land. In this particular instance, this is in Virginia. So now I'm going to say again, what is really the 1619 Project about? Is it really about Africans coming over to the Americas as slaves? Or is it really about Black Europeans coming over as prisoners of war / convicts? So what's it really about? The first 17 convicts so pardoned were handed over to Sir Thomas Smith, governor of the East India Company in the same year. Rather than being shipped to the Indies, however, they probably ended up in Virginia, the first of a long line of felons transported to Britain overseas colonial possessions. Let's continue. The British practice of convict transportation did not formally cease until the penal settlement of the Andaman Islands was wound up in 1945. In the intervening 330 years, the British transported convicts to many parts of the world. These included most of the North American colonies. In their intervening 330 years, the British transported convicts to many parts of the world. These included most of the North American colonies, the Caribbean islands of Barbados, Jamaica, Montserrat, Nevis, and St. Kitts, the slave factories at Goree and Cape Coast Castle in West Africa, the Australian colonies of New South Wales, Van Diemen's Land, I think that's Tasmania today, and Western Australia, the Indian Ocean islands of Martinique, Bencoolen, Penang, the Tanzania province, so Burma, and the Strait settlements, Singapore and Southeast Asia, as well as Bermuda and Gibraltar. So let's just highlight all of these. So again, they are clearly telling you. They're clearly telling you the amount of time that this transatlantic slave trade, i.e., they call it transportation of convicts or prisoners. They're telling you the time frame. They're telling you where they got them from and where they're shipping them to. And so North American colonies is in there. The Caribbean islands are in there. The slave factories at Goree and Cape Coast Castle in West Africa. So right here, isn't that the reverse of what they teach? Because according to the official narrative, all slaves, if you are, quote, quote, black and melanated, you came from West Africa. So if you live in the Americas, so meaning the mainland Americas, and the Caribbeans, your folks came from West Africa. But yet right here, they're saying the slave factories, they ship folks, those convicts or prisoners, they also ship them to Cape Coast Castle in West Africa. All right. They were doing it all over the world. Okay. All right. So let's look at the map that he provided. And then we'll get back into it. So he's giving you the time frames. This is an absolute excellent map. He's giving you the time frame of the transatlantic slave trade. American colonies, 1615 to 1776. Caribbeans, 1615 to 1718. Then specifically Bermuda, 1824 to 63. So you all see. But notice Africa. Notice Africa. West Africa. 1782. Both places. Goree and the Gold Coast. Okay. Then you see the other parts of the world also. Okay. So I wonder, is Gibraltar a part of Africa or Asia? Or because you see the little in-betweenness of it. But nonetheless. So you see the other time periods. Okay. But the earliest was the Americas. That was the earliest. So who made up these early American slaves? Was it Africans or was it Europeans? Let's continue. While some of these transportation flows are well documented, this is particularly the case for Australia. Others are poorly recorded and little understood. It is also striking that there have been few, if any, attempts to make sense of the British transportation policy within the empire as a whole. I wonder why that is. Because would that not totally change the narrative of who is whom? I think that it would. Let's continue. Yet, in the absence of such a broad view, it is difficult to explain fluctuations in British transportation policy over time. This article will address these issues by attempting to quantify the flow of convicts shipped from British Isles over time. Okay, so just to be clear, this diagram down here, this is representing British convicts, not African slaves, British convicts. Let's continue. This quantitative view will be used to improve an understanding of the forces that drove transportation policy and the manner in which the deployment and treatment of convicts was influenced by the experience of managing other unfree labor systems. And he's going to get into that a little bit more. Finally, the article will examine the success of the opposition to continued transportation in the 19th century and the impact that this movement had on the decline of transportation as punishment. Defining transportation. Penal transportation was not a British invention. The use of convicted labor to aid the process of European colonization of overseas territories dates back at least to the Portuguese invasion of Ceuta in North Africa in 1415. Okay. And I'm pausing because I want this to sink in. They are clearly telling you that this has always been about using prisoners of war, and in some cases using folks that actually committed crimes as labor. Okay? All right. They talk about who started it first, the Portuguese. Invasion in North Africa in 1415. Let's continue. There are arguments that it was used by other cultures at even earlier dates. Such claims depend, however, upon how transportation is defined. The wording adopted by the Australian government for... let's pause. I'll go back up to that. Let's get to this... you really did a good job. You did an excellent job, Mr. Maxwell Stewert. Okay, so the use of convicted labor to aid the process of European colonization overseas territory dates back to at least the Portugal invasion in North Africa in 1415. So let's get to the 1415. I forgot that he had put that in here as well. He's pretty clear. Okay. So this is the Portugal convicted labor / prisoners of war. These are the territories. So you see South America. Okay, so there go the North African. So from 1415 to the 1900s. Then this would be Cape Verde. I think is that still North Africa? Yeah, he said it was North Africa, so it is what it is. All right? So you see the different places that the Portuguese started with the wars. Okay? So I'm assuming that they were warring the indigenous people in Africa for their land and resources. So the Portuguese started the practice of enslaving the population and shipping them out to their other colonies for labor, which was renamed the slave trade. Okay? So as you can see in the Americas, they have Puerto Rico and Cuba, but that's 1766. Veracruz, there's no date on that. Then you get down to South America. We should be familiar with Brazil. Okay? The sugar cane. We should know that that population was based on the Portuguese slave trade. Right? And then you see, this is the French, so I don't think that's Portuguese. So I can't put that on them. I can't put that on Portuguese. That's the French drama. All right? But nonetheless, you can see. So let's continue. There are arguments that it was used by other cultures at even earlier dates. Such claims depend, however, on how transportation is defined. The wording adopted by the Australian government, for example, is the forced removal of convicts from their country of origin to a different country or place, a definition that would exclude the Han dynasty of convicts, labor and government, salt and iron monopolies, as these prisoners were not transported beyond the boundaries of China itself. So in other words, you all are, well, that's not the author saying that. This is me saying that. They want to pick and choose what definition they want to put stuff on. Because the more we get this research, the more that we see, and as I've been telling you all for quite some years, that the definition of that they're giving us for slavery, it's just not accurate. So whether or not you want to call it convicts, whether or not you want to call it transportation, whether or not you want to call it prisoners of war, whether or not you want to call it slavery, this is what happened. These kingdoms, these European kingdoms, came to indigenous people's territory to colonize. Wars broke out, of course, as they should have. And as the indigenous people lost, they were put into what has been renamed as slavery, but sentenced as convicts and shipped off to other colonies around the world. In practice, the process of convict transportation is usually assumed to include the enforced removal of prisoners via an ocean-going voyage so that their labor can be employed elsewhere, predominantly in places so remote and or possessing such high death rates that securing migrant labor by other means was difficult, if not impossible. As well as a mechanism for populating potentially dangerous corners of the empire, transportation provided the early modern British state with a degree of judicial flexibility. Prior to the early 17th century, Prisoners convicted of serious offenses were either executed or awarded lesser punishments, including whippings. By claiming benefits of clergy, an offender could escape the death penalty as long as they submitted to being branded on the thumb. This loophole could only be used once, hence the need to burn a record into the flesh of the recipient. I remember as part of the African slave trade narrative, they used slaves being branded. Let's continue. Transportation provided the state with an intermediate form of punishment that had an advantage in that it was long-term. 7 years quickly became established as the minimum length of time for which a convict could be banished. And could be expected to have deterrent value in that it was a punishment that others would fear. Yet, as Ballack and Lav pointed out, there were other options open to Stewart England. So let's be clear on who was in power when this prison colony or this prison labor system was established. The state could have built workhouses, penitentiaries, and other places of correction that would have served the same purpose. Thus, with the exception of about 50 convicts dispatched in the late 17th century to Suriname, the Dutch Republic did not transport its felons to the New Netherlands, choosing instead to sentence prisoners to confinement. All right, so in other words, the Dutch didn't use the practice of shipping their prisoners to other lands. Okay, I guess they said they did, with the exception of 50. So, child, who knows what them 50 done? All right. While the English did build many houses of corrections in the 17th century, these were primarily used to house vagrants and petty offenders who had been tried by lower courts. Sentences were short, usually less than a month. As such, they were hardly comparable with continental institutions of incarceration, and Spearsenberg describes their proliferation as a mirage. Even in the 18th century, prison sentences were sparingly used and remained brief by Dutch and German standards. The allure of transportation was that by trading property rights in the bodies of the convict, it was possible to deliver punishment on the cheap. Okay. So once again, they're telling you trading property rights in the bodies of the convicted. It was possible to deliver punishment on the cheap. So again, the concept of slavery was about using prisoners as labor. Under the parallel system of indentured, prospective migrants to the colonies who could not afford the cost of the voyage sold their labor to a shipping contract for an agreed period of time. Okay, so like I have been telling you all over the years, what slavery really meant. It was prisoners of war. It was indentured servants who had contracts. Very little African slave trade. The contractor would then resell their services to the highest bidder in the New World. What distinguished convict transportation from indenture was the length of sentence imposed upon the felon. If sentences to confinement remained short in order to keep costs down, sentences to transportation were fixed at lengthy terms for similar reasons, parsimonious reasons. As Grubbs points out, only 2% of indentured servants over the age of 14 signed contracts for more than 7 years and only 10% for more than 6. Literate, skilled adults signed the shortest contracts of all, which would make sense because they had the highest value. While the minimum sentence to transportation was 7 years, the average length of servitude for male convicts landed in Baltimore between 1767 and 1775 was 9, compared with just under 4 years of indentured servants. Not surprisingly, the past record of convicts made them less attractive to prospective buyers. Okay, so in other words, if you are a repeat offender and always got some dramatization, and based on what did you get convicted of, it's like, oh, I really don't want you. You more trouble than it's worth. Not surprisingly, the past record of convicts made them less attractive to prospective buyers. Such disadvantages, however, were offset by the additional years that felons were bound to serve. In short, the length of a sentence to transportation was fixed, not for legal reasons, but in order to position convicts competitively within the transatlantic market in unfree labor. So they wanted to make these convicts attractive versus unfree labor. So you could put the unfree labor, if you want to throw that in, with African slave trade, which we've already talked about, that the African slave trade was much more expensive, hence why in the Royal African Company of England, they stopped the practice of trading the slaves because it just had become too expensive. Counting convicts. There is a potential cost to any process of enumeration. While numbers have their place, exercises in counting can also obscure the impact of the past on individuals. As the Australian convict Thomas Brooks remarked when recalling a flogging at Moreton Bay Penal Station, how guiltily one can say 100 lashes. They were not comfortable to take, I can assure you. Yet counting is important if we wish to place experiences like those of Brooks within a wider context. Estimates of how many convicts were transported over time, for example, revealed much about the mechanisms of transportation and evolving British penal strategy. Some transportation flows were extraordinarily well recorded. We know, for example, the color of the eyes of some of the 160,000 convicts transported to the Australian colonies between the end of the Napoleonic Wars of 1868. Even for the 18th century, it is possible to name most of the 37,000 convicts estimated to have been sentenced by England and Scottish courts to transportation to Americas between 1718 and 1776. Far less is known about the transportation from Ireland in the same period. Although the best estimates is that a further 13,000 convicts were shipped from there. There are also difficulties in calculating the number of convicts transported before 1718. Okay? Which is how they're able to run this game, and this is in regards to America. Oh, come on. That's how they're able to run this game on the slave trade, the African transatlantic slave trade in the Americas. Okay. Okay. So let's continue. Coldham has painstakingly gleaned the names of over 6,000 individuals sentenced to transportation by English courts in the period 1650 to 1717, almost all of them in the period after the restoration of 1660. While pardons, deaths, and failure to finalize contracts with shipping merchants mean that some were never transported, there are also gaps in the record series, particularly for the Midland Circuit Court. Moreover, there are no data whatsoever for convicts transported out of Ireland for this period. So that's almost, 100-year gap in the records. Having spotty records, I'll put it that way. And then Ireland, which, remember, you had the upset with Cromwell shipping out the Irish, and including in that the Jacobite supporters. But we're going to continue. But in the midst of these missing records, they're telling us that it was a bunch of Africans that came over to the Americas via 1619, hence their 1619 project. Oh, okay. But yet we have documentation on the visitation of Kent, naming the families that came over to the Americas, called the 1619 Kent visitation. Okay. Taking such deficits into account, 6,000 is probably not an unreasonable estimate for those transported in the period 1661 through 1717. A considerable number of individuals were sent into exile during, there's my notes, the interim government of 1648 to 1660. And I was supposed to pull the meaning for that. So I'm assuming that's interim government. Okay. As these were poorly documented, it is difficult to estimate numbers with any certainty. There is also an argument that many of those exiled during this period should be counted as prisoners of war rather than felons. There are additional difficulties with establishing a count of convicts transported to Bermuda, 1823 to 1863, and Gibraltar, 1842 to 1874. Although 9,000 convicts are said to have been sent to each location to work in the Royal Navy dockyards, records for only half this number have been located to date. There is also a danger of double counting in that some convicts from both places were transferred to Van Diemen's Land, which that is Tasmania, Australia, and Western Australia to complete their sentences. Okay, let me just highlight that. Despite such problems, it is possible to reconstruct the flow of convicts departing from the British Isle from 1660 to 1870 with a degree of certainty. It is more difficult to calculate the numbers transported between the different colonies. Some prisoners were dispatched from the Caribbean, Canada, the Cape Colony, Martinique, India, Hong Kong, Australia, and New Zealand to the penal settlements in Bermuda, New South Wales, Van Diemen Land, which is Tasmania, and Western Australia. While these intercolonial transporters included some Africans, African Americans, South Asians, Aboriginal, and Maori prisoners, there were also attempts to segregate British penal settlements racially. So I want you all to, we read this in his introduction, this part about where the prisoners were coming from. Where are they coming from? The British Isles. He gave you where they were going to. And then he told you that there was some intercolonial transportees. Okay? So there are Africans in there. So when he say African American, I'm telling you, that is the indigenous black folk of the Americas. South Asian, and he's giving you all of that. The establishment at Bencoolen, 1787 to 1825, Penang, 1790 to 1860. I'm saying Martinique. I know that's not Martinique. Mauritius, 1815 to 1853. Singapore, 1825 to 1860. Burma, 1828 to 1863. And the Andaman Islands, 1858 to 1945, were reserved for convicts of Asian descent. So the transatlantic slave trade was worldwide. It was not exclusive to the coast of Africa. Thus, while European soldiers court-martialed in India. Okay, before I do that, I'll come back to that. Okay, so right here, he's giving you the annual number of convicts transported from Britain and Ireland. Okay, and giving you the source and all of that. He's showing you the graph. Okay, so where are they coming from? Britain and Ireland. From 1615 to 1817. This is the timeline. Okay. All right, so let me go back up there. Thus, while European soldiers court-martialed in India were forwarded to Australia, whoa! Ah! Woo, baby! That's going to come into play of importance on a later podcast that I'm going to do. So, that one messed me up. And once I get to that podcast, you'll understand why it messed me up. You will understand why. Were forwarded to Australia. Their supposed counterparts were sent to Indian Ocean settlements. While it is possible to provide broad estimates of the overall number of convicts transported within the Indian Ocean world, it is not possible to reconstruct the flow of prisoners over time. This article is therefore largely limited to analysis of the approximately 36,000 women and 204,000 men transported from the British Isles between 1661 and 1870, although at least 70,000 men and women were transported from British colonies in South and Southeast to Indian Ocean penal settlements. Okay, so just right quick, I want to put a note in here. So when I come back, prisoners shipped to Australia. Ooh, baby. I know I'm spelling it wrong. No, well, I know what I'm trying to say. All right. The majority of these were repeat offenders transported for petty theft, while an older literature followed the 19th century convention of assuming that the bulk were drawn from the ranks of the underserving poor and therefore possessed little by way of skill. This position has been questioned more recently. The convicts transported to the Americas and Australia appear to have possessed skills that were broadly representative of the wider British, Irish, and working class. But let's continue. Although political offenders made up a minority of convicts, the minority still numbered in the thousands. Some of these were transported for open acts of rebellion, but many others were exiled for civil protests. John Otter, for example, was sentenced to transportation in 1665 for attending an unlawful religious meeting and refusing to give his abode, saying his habitation was with God. Okay, I mean, that still seems minor to me when he just went to a protest. But okay. Transportation from the British Isles. Between 1660 and 1717, the number of felons sent overseas remained low, averaging around 100 per year. Before 1717, only those sentenced to death and pardon on condition of transportation could be shipped to the Americas. So, between the periods of 1660 and 1717, wasn't that many per year, about 100. But before then, those on death row were shipped to the Americas. So would that not mean that the Americas was a prison colony also? And this also lines up when France was colonizing the Americas, that Louis's brother suggested it to him, Philippe, because Louis was looking for new sources of revenue. Because these folks, that's all they know how to do is run up a bill, okay, strip the land of its natural resources, and then once they run out of said natural resources or get so much into debt, they look for new territories to take. So the newfound land, or the Americas, in this case, because they called them all Newfoundland, the Americas looked like, oh, let's see what's up over there. And Philippe was like, well, you know your soldiers not finna mess with you like that, King Louis. You already owe them money. They worn out from fighting. They're not finna go over there and just work for free, because you already owe them back pay. But now what you could possibly do, I think what you should do, send some prisoners over there. Matter of fact, I'll even go through and start hand picking them and set up the program. So France did the exact same thing. All right. While the English system was able to utilize the private trade in labor to keep state costs to a minimum, the policy had its flip side, okay? So even in the prison system today in the U.S., don't they go back and forth between privatization of the prisons and state ran? Convicts were a potentially lucrative commodity as long as they were fit, young, and skilled. Sale of the elderly and lame was unlikely to be profitable, and thus contractors were naturally selective about who they would take. The Transportation Act of 1717 contained a number of provisions designed to address these deficiencies. A proper sentencing structure was introduced: 7 years for non-capital offenses and 14 for felons reprieved from the gallows. Contracts for the shipment of convicts to the Americas were henceforth awarded to merchants who were required to post a bond that was reclaimable on production of a certificate of disembarkation. A condition of the contract was that all convicts sentenced to transportation were to be shipped within an agreed time scale. Thus, the contractor could no longer pick and choose. Child. In return, the Treasury paid a small subsidy for each transportee embarked. Okay. From 1718 to 1776, some 50,000 convicts were sold into servitude in the Americas, chiefly in the colonies of Virginia and Maryland. Did this say they went to the coast of Africa to buy people and brought them back to the Americas? No, that's not what this said. It's been pretty consistent on what they're saying. Like all of these documentations that we have gone into are pretty consistent on where the labor force / slave force came from. Okay. Now, that's not saying that there weren't Africans who were in the Americas, as what they are calling slaves, but it was really labor. But again, not in the volume that they are claiming. They accounted for 1 in every 4 migrants from the British Isles to the American colonies over the same period. The American Revolution formally brought the trade in convicts to a halt. While transportation worked because there was a demand for labor in the Americas, it was also a powerful shaper of British and American opinion. Famously, Benjamin Franklin suggested that Americans should make the trade in convicts reciprocal of sending rattlesnakes to populate the parks of London. but British perception of the American colonists were also colored by transportation. Adam Smith depicted the colonists as the refuse of jails of Europe, and Dr. Johnson as a race of convicts who ought to be thankful for anything we shall allow them short of a hanging. Now, I want to remind you all, when Benjamin Franklin also complained, everywhere he looked, there was black. And he went all around the world naming the blacks. Named Europe, he named Asia, and the Americas, and he said there was very little, which was whites. Okay? So once again, this is telling you where the slave labor came from. It is telling you. Okay? And this is just the early labor, because he's going to get to the part of white folks becoming labor as well. All right? And that's not even saying that white folks still weren't traded in between there. I know of one instance that they were traded earlier, but I'm going to say that for a separate podcast for something else. It's going to blend into something else. Transportation was particularly unpopular with free workers as competition with cheap convict labor lowered colonial wage rates. And that's exactly what Ben Franklin was complaining about. In the years immediate preceding the, so in other words, just to be clear, Ben Franklin, he didn't want African slaves. In the years immediately preceding the Revolution, artisan non-importation movements began to appear in the major seaports. At the same time, the falling cost of a transatlantic passenger undercut the rationale for the wider indentured system. You mean them African slave trades? Okay, but I'll continue. Increasingly, migrant workers were able to pay for their passage up front and were therefore less inclined to sign away labor rights in order to cover the cost of getting there. Okay, and so even with this transatlantic passage, it also includes Africans, which was very little, as well as the prisoners, because the prisoners, the price is going to be lower. They preferred migrant workers. Increasingly, migrant workers were able to pay for their passage up front and were therefore less inclined to sign away labor rights in order to cover the cost of getting there. While transportation may have been curtailed by the Revolution, its demise was accompanied by general decline and ultimate cessation of the whole. North European transatlantic trade and indentured labor. In other words, politics aside, the days of transportation to the American colonies were numbered. Okay, so let's see. Did he give a year back up here? Okay, I thought he gave a year, but he'll give it in this next one. The impact of the Revolution on transportation was abrupt. No convicts were sent to the Americas between 1777 and 1782. And while a few were dispatched from Ireland in 1780s, the policy was soon abandoned. Instead, the British turned elsewhere. Okay, so even up here, doggone it. Sorry, y'all. So even up here, when they're talking about, I was just trying to get a little benefit of the doubt, but I should have shut on up because he covered it. In the years immediately preceding the revolution, non-importation movement began to appear in the major seaports. At the same time, the falling cost of the transatlantic passage undercut the rationale for the wider perspective. So in other words, they were solely talking about European prisoners being transported to the Americas versus indentured servants. Okay. In 1780, the Dutch entered the American Revolutionary War, threatening British slaving interests in West Africa. The 13 British forts located between Senegambia and Whydah were manned by just 554 disease-ridden troops. There was also a shortage of laborers and canoe men employed by the Company of Merchants trading out of Africa. Okay. Competition between Europeans was particularly fierce on the Gold Coast, where there were also 12 forts in the Dutch hands. Some of the rivals' establishments were so close to each other that they were in range of each other's guns. So they're telling you that the slave trade, what they're calling the slave trade over in Africa, just trade period, was really, really competitive. Now let's continue. The European hold on these tiny enclaves was, to say the least, tenuous. As the company admitted, it is necessary to keep black men of power in our pay that we may live at peace with the natives who would otherwise molest us, knowing we have sufficient power to protect ourselves. In order to shore up defenses, 2 independent companies were formed out of 350 convicts, reprieved on condition of overseas service. These were distributed among several forts from the island of Goree in Senegambia to Cape Coast Castle. A further 40 convicts were transported to the following year on the Dem Kaiser, a slaving vessel hired for the occasion. In this, the British were merely following European practice. The Portuguese had long transported convicts to Africa. In this, the British were merely following European practice. The Portuguese had long transported convicts to Africa. Okay, so remember back up here, bear with me, sorry, hope this not making you too dizzy. All right, I'm sorry in advance. And I think the visual helps us big time, so bear with me. Remember up here when he was talking about the Portuguese were the first to do it. The Portuguese were the first to do it. So they were also sending folks to Africa and then folks coming out of Africa. All right. Let's get back. Sorry again if I'm making you dizzy with this. All right, we're almost there. They had been used to construct and man the first fortifications on the Gold Coast in the 15th century. So the Portuguese sent their convicts over to Africa. to build forts in the 1500s. This was a policy driven by the fearful reputation of the region. Death rates among Europeans in tropical Africa were so great that it was expected that as many 50% would die within a year of arrival. As the popular rhyme would have it, beware, beware the bite of Benin. For one that comes out, there's 40 go in. It was thought to be morally just that convicts should be sent to such zones in order to spare the lives of others. All agreed, however, that the experiment with the independent companies was a total disaster. Of those who survived the ravages of disease, some deserted to the Dutch. Others seized vessels or escaped into the interior. Those that remained traded their equipment together with the fort fitting. They literally took the doors off their hinges in return for alcohol supplied by the West African dealers. So in other words, they say, oh, MF, you think you gonna sit up here and work me to death on this African coast? This equipment that you gave us to build these forts, we gonna strip all of this bad boy stuff down. We out of here. The company had protests about the scheme from the start. They were concerned that the deployment of convict labor would undermine European authority by demonstrating that whites could be enslaved as well as Africans. Similar fears may have played a role in the racial segregation of the Australian and Indian Ocean penal settlements. Yep. Okay. So again, when we talk about the transatlantic slave trade, it was a worldwide system that consisted of convicts, prisoners, primarily from Europe, that was shipped across the world. Okay? And also shipped among the different colonies around the world. So meaning you also had laborers coming off the coast of Africa in those particular colonies, going around the world also to other colonies. Okay? And now they're introducing you, telling you that also that meant, yeah, white people can be enslaved also. Okay? Now, before I get into just a little bit of supplement of white people being enslaved, and those of you that rock with me, you know this is not new. Before I get into that, I want you to remember who held the seat of power when these European kingdoms were ruled by black, quote, quote, nobility. So the Stewart line was black. King Charles them was black. Queen Elizabeth was black. Louis them, black. All of the Europeans were black. So the prisoners of war initially were black. Let's go into the white slaves. So this is a very good book. It is an easy read. It's called They Were White and They Were Slaves, The Untold History of the Enslavement of Whites in Early America by Michael A. Hoffman II. All right, so this is on page 14. The Memoirs of Pere Labat, 1693 to 1705. Page 125. Even blacks refer to the white forced laborers in the colony as white slaves. And then he goes on to describe the conditions. This is on page 17. The English historian William Cobbett stated in 1836, the starving agricultural laborers of southern England are worse off than American Negroes. We heard the same thing about the differences between the black, Irish, and Jamaica, and the white Irish in Jamaica. We heard the exact same thing, that the conditions were worse for the white laborers. When in 1834, English farm worker in Dorset tried to form a union in order to preserve ourselves, our wives, and our children from starvation, they were shipped into slavery in Australia for this crime. So this is lining right up to what this author is speaking on. The situation of white factory workers was no better. Robert Owen declared in 1840, the working classes of Great Britain are in a worse condition than any slave in any country in any period of the world's history. Okay. All right. So again, we see the word factories. We saw that factories when we did the podcast on the African Royal Company, on how they had factories. You know, factories to manufacture goods. Yeah, same as today. But they had indentured servants / convicted convicts working in said factories. And so now you know that label of slavery. It's really about prisoners of war, convicted felons, black folk, white folk. It wasn't about race. It was about serving these European empires so their conquest of other indigenous peoples' lands could be successful. They were also worried, rightfully as it turned out, that the actions of the convicts might undermine the local operation of the slave trade. Some West African middlemen refused to supply slaves to the company after being swindled for their transportees. Despite this, the unpromising start, the British persisted with the idea by the Treaty of Versailles, which formally brought the War of the American Revolution to a close. The British acquired exclusive rights to the Gambia River. In order to secure the territory, it was proposed to send convicts to McCarthy Island, about 320 kilometers from the river mouth. In anticipation of the scheme, the island was purchased from local chiefs for 1,000, I'm assuming that's pounds. The plan was abandoned, however, after a select committee concluded that it would be a huge to a death sentence, despite recommendations that the prisoners be issued with cinchonia or Jesuit bark to protect them from the ravages of malaria. Having given up on the idea of using convict labor to facilitate slave trading, this is pretty consistent on what slave trading really was. The British explored the possibility of employing penal labor to set up a base at Das Voltas Bay in present-day Namibia. A vessel dispatched to survey the site reported that it was a desert and totally inhospitable. The British turned instead to Botany Bay, a potentially strategic deep water anchor on the edge of the Pacific. Distance from the metropole may have had its appeal, while the increase in the volume of shipping across the Atlantic made it possible for convicts to return from the American colonies. Australia was altogether more isolated. Banishment there, even for those on a 7-year sentence, would for all intents and purposes be for life. It thus might be construed as a punishment that the poor would fear. Okay. Yet, as can be seen from Figure 3, transportation to Australia remained intermittent for the next quarter of a century. This is curious, for the standard explanation for the Botany Bay decision was that it was a measure taken out of desperation to alleviate the build-up in the number of convicts incommodiously accommodated in hulks of Thames and Solent estuaries. Yet, after the first, second, and third fleets had been dispatched to Australia, there was a strange lull in the number of convicts transported. The simple explanation for this was that war again intervened. Okay, so he's just here showing you somebody had drew or sketched a convict, or it literally says prison ship in Port Harbor, convicts going abroad. Not slaves, convicts. And again, Australia is consistent with that. This is known in Australia. But what he is revealing to the rest of us is that the transatlantic slave, what they're calling slave trade, was really about the transatlantic prison trade or prisoner trade, or shipping out your convicts around the world to your different colonies. Okay? Whenever Britain was at war, the number of convicts transported declined, which that makes sense. For one, shipping was more expensive. Not only was there the risk of capture, but the diminishing supply of sailors that resulted from increased naval recruitment drove up wages. There were similar effects on land. Wars were periods of fuller employment where increased military recruitment soaked up the surplus labor. So again, there you have it. This was particularly so this was particularly so after the passing of the Press Act in 1704 that specifically targeted able-bodied men who did not have lawful employment or calling or visible means for their maintenance and livelihood. Fewer unemployment meant that fewer crimes were committed. And that's interesting because even today, when they look at crime and they look at the underlying root cause of crime, they always link it to employment. So that's interesting. There were other subtle effects too. Convict labor had its uses during times of conflict. We have already seen how the entry of the Dutch into the American Revolutionary War spawned a plan to send a detachment of convict soldiers to Africa. Just want to put that in there yet again. This was no novel scheme. At least as early as 1766, prisoners, especially those with military experience, were reprieved on condition of overseas services. Yep, so Dutch shipping convicts to Africa. All right. Units raised in this manner were invariably sent to theaters characterized by high disease rates. This was really transportation in all but name. The minimum period of service was 7 years, and death rates were certainly higher than amongst convicts dispatched to either the Americas or Australia colonies. Okay, so in other words, you get shipped over to Africa, baby, you just might as well, what they said was a 50% death rate. So you had a 50% chance of living. But if you were shipped to the Americas or Australia colonies, you had a better chance of living. So logically, where would the highest number of labor, even if you want to put slave labor, come from? Would it come from the most risky place? Africa? So that doesn't matter if it's coming or going. Or would it be coming from Europe to America, Europe to Australia? I mean, this is simple economics, folks. But let's continue. Units raised in this manner were invariably sent to theaters characterized by high disease rates. This was really transportation and all, but let me read that again. Units raised in this manner were invariably sent to theaters characterized by high disease rates. This was really transportation and all but name. The minimum period of service was 7 years, and death rates were certainly higher than among convicts dispatched to either the American or Australian colonies. So in other words, Africa was higher. Okay. The use of this device increased during the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. Buckley estimated that around 20% of the regular British Army in the Windward and Leeward Islands between 1799 and 1802 was composed of civil and military offenders. Others were sent to Africa. The African Corps, established in 1800 and based at Goree took over the role of the ill-fated independent companies that were finally disbanded in 1784. While the regiment went through several title changes, it was fairly long-lived. As late as 1822, a draft of convict volunteers were sent to the Cape to join the newly styled Royal African Colonial Corps. So, seems like what the author has described is this is a reverse of the African slave trade from Europe to Africa. Let's continue. All right, so in this particular graph, he gives the number of convicts transported and strength of the British Army, 1690 to 1820. And he's giving you the source of where he got this information. So you could see. Wow, you can see the War of Spain, it went up. Not too much for the War of Austrian. The 7-Year War, to be honest, I expected it to be higher in the 7-Year War. But maybe because that was really a world war. Okay, American Revolution and the Revolutionary Wars was high. The Napoleonic War was the highest. Wow. Okay. So it's showing you the number of soldiers mobilized. So the highest number of soldiers mobilized was 400,000, and that was during the Napoleonic War, 1803 to 1815. So the number of folk transported, let's see what was the highest. Okay, so they're saying the American Revolution, 1775 to 1830. So a little bit over 200,000. Okay. All right. Now remember, number of convicts. So prisoners of war. Okay. So let's continue. That's a great graph. Did an absolute wonderful job with this. Which would make sense. Sorry, I don't mean to make y'all dizzy. Which would make sense. Because if you're going around colonizing indigenous people's stuff, or if you're fighting with these other European kingdoms on territories that you have either colonized, you're trying to defend your colonies, or you're trying to take over somebody else's colonies, but make no mistake, it's not yours to begin with. It's the indigenous people of that land. Yeah, you're going to be dispatching troops. So the colonists that are already there and their convicts that they already got stationed there, plus the indigenous people that's already there, they're going to be warring with the new set of colonists coming into play. And then whoever wins that war going to package up some more convicts and ship them to other colonies. Okay? So either they ship them to other colonies. I don't even have to say that. They ship them to other colonies around the world. Let's just make it simple. So again, the transatlantic slave trade was not exclusively about Africa. Let's continue. Convict labor had its uses within the British Isles too. While often thought of as emergency detention centers, the hulks are probably better seen as mobile labor depots. The convicts on board them were used to load supplies onto warships. This explained the origins of shot drill, an exercise performed in prisons in the 19th century. As Benny and Mayhew described in the 1860s, shot was moved from one side of the yard to the other through the successive hands of a chain prisoners. When the pile at one end was depleted, the exercise was reversed. The two journalists concluded that it was impossible to imagine anything more ingeniously useless than this form of hard labor. Yet, in its original form, the exercise had a very practical use. It was employed to load shot onto men of war. Convicts also constructed coastal defenses and helped to dredge shipping canals. So who was building them forts around the world and canals? Convicts? That's interesting. So convicts with military background were building the forts, which makes sense. And then they also build shipping channels or canals. Makes sense. They also went to the colonies to perform other labor. So farming in the Americas, cotton, makes sense. Sugar cane, makes sense. So let's continue. While few prisoners were transported during periods of warfare, the cessation of hostilities invariably brought changed circumstances. The rapid demobilization of large numbers of soldiers and sailors led to a decrease in the demand for convict labor in the docks and an increased supply in the form of newly convicted criminals. It had been the increase in convictions that had followed the ending of the War of Spanish Succession that had led to the Transportation Act of 1717. So there you have it. So they're telling you that they were getting their convicted labor, that convicted labor that fueled the transatlantic slave trade from war. Okay, but before they do that, because they gotta put in writing what they gonna do and get somebody to approve what they gonna do. That's what the Transportation Act of 1717, that's why it was created. Each successive demobilization resulted in higher levels of unemployment and increase in crime and subsequent arrests. So in other words, if you got skilled prisoners of war that you're telling them you need to go over, you need to work this, work the docks, work this, work this, work that, then your regular population, you're putting them out of jobs. Okay? So they always link unemployment with crime. That's even in the statistics today. Few convicts were initially sent to Australia because the outbreak of hostilities with France in 1792 ensured that there were few to send. With the exception of the brief peace following the Treaty of Amiens in 1802, Britain remained at war until 1815. The demobilization that followed, however, was an unprecedented scale. Up until this point, Britain's Antipodean settlements remained geographically restricted to the Cumberland Plain, the Cumberland Plain and mouth of the Hunter River in New South Wales, and Tamar and Derwent estuaries in Van Diemen's Land, okay, remember that's Tasmania. Whereas transportation to, okay, and I'm going to get there in a minute, the Americas had been conducted as a private trade. The lack of prior European settlement in Australia necessitated a greater deal of government involvement. Okay, so shout out to him. Shout out to Maxwell Stewert. This is excellent, by the way, Maxwell Stewert. But he's telling you that the Americas trade was all privatized. So the private prison labor, aka that they call transatlantic slave trade, was all privatized. But when they were stocking labor for Australia, the government had to get involved. Okay? All right. So up here, and he's giving you New South Wales. Okay, so Cumberland Plain. I don't know if Hunter Valley, I'm assuming it is. It's a part of that also. And then this is Tasmania. Okay, so he's even telling you where they were pulling people from for the area of Tasmania. Child. Let's continue. It took direct charge of the shipping of convicts to the antipodes and the cost of maintaining the prisoners while they remain under sentence. While some of the costs of this were offset by the work performed by convicts, sentences were often shortened in order to relieve the government of the cost of maintaining felons. Child, wasn't that the case? And when they were saying when the state runs prisons, when they're funding them and all of that jazz, that sometimes the costs get so much for the state that they start shortening sentences. So I just find it's really interesting as we go through this, that they use some of the same logic today regarding the prison system. While some of the costs of this were offset by maybe I didn't read that. I'll just read it again. While some of the costs of this were offset by the work performed by the convicts, sentences were often shortened in order to relieve the government of the cost of maintaining felons. Once freed, former convicts were provided with land in order to encourage them to become self-sufficient. Whereas there were occasional brutal punishment, the conditions experienced by the majority of the transported were surprisingly benign. The influx of fresh arrivals post the Napoleonic War precipitated huge changes. In 1817, John Thomas Bigg, a former deputy judge advocate of the slave colony of Trinidad, was commissioned by the British government to write a report on the state of Tasmanian Island, but now back then it was Van Diemen's Land and New South Wales. A critic of the allocation of small blocks of land to former convicts, Bigg thought that the future of the colony lay in pastoralism. Child. So Blood wanted to bring the cloth of the church up into it. He recommended that access to land should henceforth be restricted to free immigrants with capital. He also advocated an extension of the existing system of assigning convict labor to free settlers. Under this arrangement, the settler was responsible for clothing, feeding, and accommodating the convict in return for their labor. Settler could not physically punish their charges, but they could order them before a magistrate's bench. Those found guilty were punished by the state. Bigg recommended a huge increase in the practice of assignment, although he argued that the recipients of convict labor should be restricted to those of means. Assignment was cheap. Bigg calculated that it would save the government 24 pounds and 10 shillings for every convict so disposed of. In order to keep this semi-privatized prison force in line, he also advocated an extension in the number of government-run state punishments. Okay, so old boy Bigg is just proposing a mix between privatization and government sponsor of prisoners. But again, this is explaining the transatlantic slave trade really was about a labor trade using prison labor or convicted people that were convicted to a sentence. So in this case, they're trying to set up how the prison labor was going to work from Europe, and specifically Newcastle or Cumberland Plain area to Tasmanian Island. Okay? So he's saying let the settlers cover the costs and all of that jazz. Let them deal with the cost. But they can't issue out sentences or punishments or any of that. If the convict gets out of line, they need to go back before the court system or the magistrate's bench to get sentencing. All right. Okay, so here it's showing the convicts at work in Van Diemen's land gathering the harvest. Okay. All right. Bigg's recommendation ushered in what became known as the assignment system, a multi-layered approach to convict management. The majority of newly arrived prisoners were assigned to settlers. As a reward for good conduct, convicts could be provided with a ticket of leave, which enabled them to work for a wage. On the other hand, those who were found guilty of committing further offenses could be sentenced by a magistrate's bench or a higher court to term of punishment in a road party, chain gang, or penal station. Okay, so pretty much just summing up what we said. All right, okay. A similar system operated for female convicts, except instead of being sent to road parties and penal stations, those returned for punishment were housed in female factories where they were divided into different classes according to conduct. The arrangement was popular with the Tory administration as it was cheap to administer, fostered colonial growth, and could be expected to be feared by British and Irish working class. So again, being pretty specific on where the transatlantic slave force is coming from, which is really prisoners of war and convicts. So in this case, he's getting into details of Australia. And just like it was for the rest of the world, including Africa, same held true in Australia. And now we should understand why when they talk about the African transatlantic slave trade and they only relegate it to the west coast of Africa, that is because that is where the British, Dutch, and Portugal empires had agreements with those said African nations to do business. Either they had agreements to do business or they fought wars. In the case of Portugal, fought wars and set up colonies. So just to let that sink in on the African slave trade, why it is delegated to West Africa only, it is because those European empires either had contracts to do business with those said West African nations, or in the case of Portugal, they fought a war in those specific areas, and I think Portugal, it was North Africa, and they had colonies. So that means within that African slave trade, they were bringing over their prisoners to Africa to work, to build ports, etc., and work in their factories. So again, those European nations were bringing over their convicts over to Africa to build ports and to work in those African factories. Because remember, in the case of the English African Royal Company, we know that they were trading in goods as well as labor. Okay, so they were bringing over their own folks, and then other folks were also being dispatched. Labor was being dispatched to their other colonies. So that labor could have also been, I'm sure there were, African chiefs who were selling their people to those European kingdoms. And either they were working right there in one of the factories, or they shipped them to other colonies around the world. And in the case of Portugal, they shipped folk to Brazil. Although they shipped them to other places too, but a high number of Brazilians came from the coast of Africa to work in the sugar plantation. But you also have to keep in mind that some of those folks, them Africans, could have also been some of their own prisoners. Okay? In the case of the Americas, again, very little Africans. Very little Africans. Because the British system, they used Europeans, specifically Black Europeans, prisoners of war / convicts. So let's continue. Under the assignment system, the number of convicts transported to New South Wales and Van Diemen's Land, which is Tasmania, peaked in 1833 when nearly 7,000 were landed on the fatal shores in a single year. Therefore, thereafter, the numbers were wound back as transportation came under sustained attack first from critics in the British Isles, and then later from a colonial-based anti-transportation movement. So it sounds like what they labeling as anti-slavery movement. Okay, but we'll continue. The election in 1830 of the first wholly Whig government since 1783 marked a substantial shift in government policy. The Whigs were in favor of assisted migration, sympathetic to the penal reform movement, avowed opponents of slavery. Now remember, the U.S. had a Whig party also. And that Whig party was also members of the Whig party were also helped in establishing the colony of Liberia. And that was trying to get, they call freed blacks, which now we should know were freed black Europeans, to go back, not even back, to go to Africa, to set up and maintain a colony in Liberia. Okay, so when they talk about the Whigs were in favor of assisted migration, sympathetic to the penal reform movement, and avowed opponents of slavery. This is not new. This is exactly what happened in the Americas. The supporters of all three causes view transportation as the best problematic. In their view, the presence of convicts made it difficult to promote the Australian colonies as a suitable designation for free working class immigrants. Was this not the same complaint from Benjamin Franklin in America? Yes, it was. Because it's the same script, it's the same formula. The assignment system was clearly at odds with the principles of the penitentiary, with its emphasis on non-physical punishment, and there was more than a whiff of slavery about the manner in which convicts were assigned to private individuals. So again, they're telling you that these convicts were put in the position of slaves. Okay? That this transportation system was really a system of slavery based on the treatment, the conditions. It wasn't about reform, none of that. Okay? So hence why today they've totally changed the definition of what slavery meant. That everybody came from Africa. So everybody in what we're calling today the United States came from Africa. Everybody in South America came from Africa. Everybody in the Caribbeans came from Africa. And all black folks in Europe came from Africa too. So if you are black, you came from Africa. And let's exclude Caucasian/whites from being a part of this process because they were the ones doing the enslavement. But yet the records state that white folks became slaves also. They were also sentenced as convicts to said colonies. And we know in the case of Jamaica, which we can pretty much not even assume because we have two accounts, the one in Jamaica, it tells you that the first ones to hit Jamaica, they were black folk, black European, and black Irish. Because they had to put a law on the books at a later date to let white folks come in as servants, and the white folks were treated worse. And then you had Ben Franklin on the mainland in Americas saying, look, don't send no more black folks over here. Don't send them over here. And he was not saying just from Africa. He named everywhere I look, it's black people all around the world. And we also know through someone's journals and account that the Stewart dynasty, it was said to not mention their race. So in other words, we know that it was whitewashed. As we show you evidence of the original pictures of those European dynasties were black people. Okay? All right, so let's look at this system. All right, so it's saying it is no accident that the numbers transported went into permanent decline in that same year, 1834, as slavery was abolished within the British Empire. While the committee assembled to inquire into transportation recommended that it should also be abolished in favor of the expanded use of penitentiaries, the government balked at the cost and comparison. So it is clearly telling you right here that the abolishment of slavery in 1834, they were really talking about abolishment of convict labor. So in other words, look, y'all sitting up here, you got a system of quote, quote, slavery, what we're calling it today, convicted labor. And prisoners of war was what it was. That needs to stop. You need to build prisons or penitentiaries to house your convicts and your prisoners of war. And the government look, listen here, Nat. That's too expensive. We don't want to foot the bill for that, nor the responsibility. All right, so let's look at the post-big convict system from 1823. This is when they came up with it. So prior to 1823, the transatlantic slave trade was prison labor. So again, prior to 1823, the worldwide transatlantic slave trade was prison labor. All right. So Big saying, okay, for the men, the gallows, penal stations, chain gangs, road parties, assigned to private settlers, ticket of leave, conditional pardon, full pardon. So this is the new way that he proposed to deal with prisoners. Okay? So the gallows, penal station, chain gangs, road parties, those are all footing the bill to England. Soon as they get assigned to a private settler, that's on the settler. But in order to get a pardon and all of that, they still had to go through the British court system. So this is a mixture of public and private on how they're going to handle prisoners. Okay? So again, the transatlantic slave system they used prison labor / prisoners of wars. Okay, so for the women, gallows, factory crime class, factory second class, factory first class. So all of those England is footing the bill for it. Then when you get to assigned to private settler, ticket to leave, condition pardon, full pardon. Transportation to New South Wales was abandoned in 1840, but continued to Van Diemen's Land, albeit in a modified form. Okay, so they're telling you even here that they use a system in New South Wales. So even New South Wales, fam, they had convicted slave labor as well. The newly introduced probation system attempted to allow the deployment of convict labor with the key principles of penitentiary management. Yep. All convicts were to henceforth undergo a period of probationary labor on the roads of arrival to Australia. Once the prisoner had emerged from this probationary stage, they could be hired by private individuals for a nominal wage, a practice designed to distance transportation from the charge that it was merely a form of slavery in disguise. From the outset, the scheme was a disaster. The supply of assigned servants was reduced as the newly arrived convicts were fed into the probation station. As a consequence, wage rates climbed for the first time since the early 1820s. Then, just as the effect of the 1840s global recession hit Van Diemen's Land, the first cohort of probationers emerged onto the labor market, which was, as a consequently, quickly glutted. While the number of convicts transported had gone into sharp decline in the 1830s, the trend was now temporarily reversed. Okay, so they're just simply talking supply and demand of labor. As the recession deepened in Britain, more were sent. They piled up in probation stations and the hastily constructed hiring depots that housed those unable to secure a contract with a private employer. In this climate, many colonists joined the clamor of voices from the British Isles calling for an end to transportation. There was particularly anger that the colonies were expected to pay the cost of the constructing and running of the probation stations, but receive little by way of economic benefit. Transportation was increasingly seen as a morally polluting institution that had to be abolished in order to protect the reputation of the colony. So was it really to protect the reputation of the colony, or they were tired of this up and down of the cost? They were tired of it. Sometimes it's profitable based on economic conditions. Then other times it's not profitable. But in either case, the colony had to bear that cost. So was it really a moral issue, or was it really an economic issue? I'm just saying. As in America, in the run-up to the revolution, the embryonic trade union movement played an important part in the campaign, attempting to protect free wage rates from the threat of competition from cheap, unfree labor. Despite vigorous opposition, the government pressed on with transportation, largely because of the expense associated with the construction of penitentiaries in the British Isle and the knowledge that few convicts returned from exile in the colonies. So in other words, British government like, look, I ain't trying to hear that foolishness you sitting up here talking. Once these convicts leave off this shore, player, we don't give a so-and-so what happened. That's y'all's responsibility to run them colonies properly and it to be profitable. Now, you done set up here and whined that you need labor. You done set up here and whined that you need labor. And now we providing you with labor. Now you want to complain on how we're sending you the labor and how it's impacting your colony. We don't care nothing about that. And while you at it, don't forget you owe me your payment or your taxes off of the profits that you generating off them colonies. In an attempt to mollify colonial opposition, convicts were ordered to serve the first half of their sentence in Britain before being removed to the colonies, already bearing a ticket of leave. So like I said, they really didn't care, but okay, we hear y'all rumbling this, that, and the third. We'll have them serve half the time over here, then go over there. Now remember, this is still talking about the convicts coming out of Europe. Okay? So even though this is specifically talking about Australia, but it was just telling you same thing was happening in the back during the American times too. It was the discovery of gold on the Australian mainland, however, that finally ended transportation to Van Diemen's Land. There seemed little point in giving free passage to prisoners to a place a short distance removed from the epicenter of a gold rush. The last vessel arrived in 1853. Transportation lingered on in Western Australia, where it had been introduced in 1850 as a response to chronic labor shortage. So in other words, wait, you trying to tell me it's gold? Oh, wait a minute. You found gold? Oh yeah, hold up. That's more profitable. All right, we gonna stop sending y'all the convicts. Cause this gold, oh yeah, we gonna handle that. But in the meantime, Western Australia, y'all still need labor. You got a chronic labor shortage. Okay, get ready to get these convicts. Convicts also continue to be sent to Bermuda until 1863, when the last prisoners were returned to the British Isle and to Gibraltar until the hulks there were broken up in 1874. So once again, they're telling you where this labor was coming from. Okay? And in the case of Bermuda, in 1863, they even returned the last prisoners to where? The British Isles and Gibraltar. By then, the only British convict settlement that remained was on the Andaman Islands. All right. Evaluating British transportation policy. In some ways, excuse me, in some ways, British transportation policy remained remarkably consistent over time. The minimum sentence of 7 years, first fixed in the 17th century, remained in place until at least the second half of the 19th century. As we have seen, this was originally introduced for economic rather than penal reasons. The collapse of the transatlantic market in indentured servants in the late 18th and 19th century forced the government to play a more proactive role in the process of shipping felons overseas. So I do not want us to take this sentence lightly. The collapse of the transatlantic market in indentured servants in the late 1800s and early 19th century. So didn't they tell you slavery was abolished in the United States in 1865? So in other words, and remember this was worldwide, he showed you the transporting of the convicts was worldwide. Okay? So this private market was shut down of transporting indentured servants around the world. And now the government had to be more involved in the process of shipping felons overseas. But again, where is the folks coming from that went into indentured servitude / slavery? They were the convicts. Okay? So whether you were convicted of local crimes in Europe, or if you were a prisoner of war, same difference. All right. There is more than a hint, however, that the West African experiment in the 1780s may have been in part motivated by an attempt to co-opt the slave trade into performing this role. Having disposed of its convict charges to a number of different forts, the then Kaiser took on board a cargo of slaves for the sale in the Caribbean. When opportunity arose after the Napoleonic Wars, the British government did its best to privatize transportation once more, dramatically expanding the number of convicts assigned to private service. Okay, so doggone it. I hate when it does that. Oh, okay, I have to put something in here to get this out of this. Sorry, bear with me. Bear with me. Okay, come on out of there. Let me highlight. All right. So you see where it's saying the Napoleonic Wars. So having disposed of its convict charges to a number of different forts, The Den Kaiser took on board a cargo of slaves for sale in the Caribbean. Okay, so again, prisoners of war, even if you want to say convicts, whatever the case, really both. When the opportunity arose after the Napoleonic Wars, the British government did its best to privatize transportation once more, dramatically expanding the number of convicts assigned to private service. It is significant that the man upon whose recommendation these changes were made, Commissioner Bigg, had formerly served in the British Caribbean and had firsthand experience of operating of plantation slavery. When assignment was abolished following the intervention of the Whig governments of the 1830s, the economic rationale for transportation was comprised, and colonial opposition to the practice mounted. Oh, shoot. All right. So just to point out that the West African experiment in 1780s. Okay. So this even once again is letting you know that the transatlantic slave trade was not exclusively coming from West Africa. This is giving you a specific date that they experimented with slave trading, aka convict trading, in West Africa in 1780. So that meant, just like his other graph showed you, that slaves in the 1600s and the 1700s, what they're calling slaves, was not coming from West Africa. Was coming from Europe. So those black folk that they are labeling as Africans in the 1600s and 1700s were black Europeans. And the Africans that did so happen make it over to the Americas and the Caribbeans, they came at a later date, the 1780s. And it wasn't successful. But let's continue. Were the critics of the transportation right to argue that it amounted to a species of slavery? The short answer is no. The children of convicts, for example, were not born the chattel of others. Convict transportation, however, had many similarities with other systems of unfree labor, especially indentured, and some peculiar twist of its own. As Evan and Thorpe point out, it was not in a master's interest to beat a slave beyond the point that it was profitable to do so. For a minority of prisoners sent to colonial penal stations to undergo further punishment, this was certainly not the case. They were deliberately deprived of labor-saving devices such as draft animals in order to ensure that the work hurt. Here, punishment was considered an output in its own right. In an era where penal reformers denounced the use of the lash and leg irons as instruments of reform, transportation was inevitably viewed as an outmoded form of correction. Its critics, however, were also concerned that the weight of punishment fell unevenly on convict bodies. As the Select Committee on Transportation reported in 1838, it was in master's interest to treat skilled convicts better than unskilled. This was an accurate observation. Unskilled convicts were disproportionately represented among those sentenced to be flogged or who served in time in road gangs, chain gangs, and penal stations. Transportation also had peculiar impacts on men and women. After the Big Report, there was an increase in the demand for the labor of female convicts who were required to service the homes of wealthy free settlers. In order to increase the supply of bonded labor, the state reversed its pre-Big policy of encouraging marriage as a way of reducing the number of female convicts supported by the government. Okay? As Reed has shown, while nearly 45% of female convicts still under sentence were married in 1822, the proportion dropped to a little over 7% in the decades 1832 to 1842. So by this time, we also have to make note that the convicts were really a lot of white people coming over. Okay? And we know this based on Jamaica's policy, and we know this also based on what Ben Franklin was saying. The shift was accompanied by disciplinary devices created to criminalize convicts' attempts to form de facto unions while under sentence. Convict servants who fell pregnant were sent to the House of Correction or factory. After giving birth, mothers were permitted to wean their children. Therefore, they were separated, the convict being shifted to a separate yard to undergo a period of a 6-month punishment. Okay, so this is telling you of the separation of mother and child during the mother's prison sentence in the colony. Okay? From children in the colonies during a prison sentence. All right? This mostly consisted of labor at the wash tubs, servicing the laundry requirements of the state and nearby private households. Suitably, chastised female convicts were redeployed into assigned service, whereas their children were sent to what euphemistically known as orphan schools. Boom. So when we think about the orphans, who do we think about? White children. Let's continue. The factory was thus much more than a disciplinary institution. It was an ancillary device designed to facilitate the servicing of colonial middle-class households. Transportation impacted upon household formation amongst former convicts in other ways too. While existing studies have linked as many as 90% of transported women to a colonial marriage, these marriages mostly occurred after sentence. The enforced delay lowered fertility rates, effectively reducing the size of ex-convict households. Initial explorations have suggested that the mean number of registered births may have been as low as 1.7 per former convict family. By contrast to women, only around 1 in 4 male convicts married after the arrival in Australia. The imbalance between the genders making it difficult for many to find partners. Of those that did marry, the majority were skilled men on short sentences. Did transportation do much harm to the colonies? There were many that thought it would. An early critic was Francis Bacon, who argued that it was a shameful and unblessed thing to take the scum of people with whom you plant And not only so, but it spoileth the plantation, for they will ever live like roes and not fall to work. Yet the evidence suggests that the contrary was true. Transportation provided an important stimulus to colonial growth through the exploitation of the bodies of its convict charges and that of free workers who had to compete with the labor of transported prisoners. There is also little evidence that the colonies were transferred into dens of inequity as a result of the process. Quite the contrary. Tasmania, as Van Diemen's Land was renamed in 1856, had remarkably low rates of serious crime in the second half of the 19th and 20th century. This despite the fact that a greater proportion of Tasmanians were transported, either convicts or the descendants of convicts, than elsewhere in Australia. Okay, so I am directly linking in this situation the Tasmanian population of convicts with white people. A more detailed, and just to be clear, the population in the Americas, the first convicts in the Americas or prisoners of war were black people from Europe. Okay, some Africans, but that was very short-lived in the 1780s time frame. So white folks started coming in late 1700s, 1800s. And we know what happened in the 19th century. They decided to finally semi-tell the truth on that. Okay? And the white folks were coming from Europe as well as convicts. And in cases, they were snatching people off the street. You don't have a job? Oh, you out of here. Oh, you an orphan? You out of here. How did you become an orphan? Oh, your parents were taken out from war? You out of here. Right? This despite the fact that a great proportion of Tasmanians were transported, either convicts or the descendant of convicts, than elsewhere in Australia. A more detailed analysis of recidivism rate in Western Australia has produced similar conclusion. While former convicts disproportionately found themselves up before the magistrate, few committed crimes that landed them in the higher courts. Tasmania and Western Australia were remarkably law-abiding places despite being tainted by the stain of convict labor. That is really, really interesting. Yet, this does not necessarily make the process less exploitative. Exactly. As Karl Marx recognized, the philanthropic object behind transportation was to create an artificial surplus in the labor market by drawing forced convict labor into competition with free labor. So right here, Karl Marx is describing what they're calling today as the transatlantic slave system. So Karl Marx is describing the system and root reason for the transatlantic slave trade, aka prison labor. So I hope you all are getting a good idea of why what they are calling the African transatlantic slave trade is not accurate. This was a worldwide system. The convicts that were sent to Australia in the 19th century may have been comparatively well looked after compared with those transported in earlier centuries, which makes sense why, if they were still doing it all the way up until in the 19th century, that would make sense why they set up and told the truth about Australia. Death rates on convict vessels to the antipodes, for example, were remarkably low. Yet, despite fears that the process would lead to the founding of a criminal republic, the societies that convict labor helped to create were hierarchical. This was especially true of Western Australia and Van Diemen's Land, which is Tasmania, both of which were little affected by the wave of free migration and associated with the mid-century gold rush. The effective outcome of transportation was not so much that it enabled a new start for the convict, but it has assisted the respectable migrant quest to establish a comfortable living. In conclusion, as Oxley and Meredith point out, there are parallels between the abolishment of transportation to the American colonies in the late 18th century and the demise of the punishment in the 19th century. Transportation worked because it supplied cheap labor to the colonies. Its success, however, contained the seeds of its demise. As both the American and Australian economies grew, they became destinations that were less calculated to produce fear within the ranks of the British and working classes. The presence of convict labor also caused increased resentment as the size of the colonial free labor force increased. In the 19th century, these factors were exacerbated by the emergence of a powerful British-based lobby that pillarized transportation as a form of free labor akin to slavery. Therefore, penal exile from the British Isles died a slow death maintained into the late 1860s only by the demand for labor in Western Australia and the naval docks in Bermuda and Gibraltar. Okay, so this is again by author Hamish Maxwell Stewert. And you can also, he's known for his work on convict transportation to Australia. We talked about his books earlier, Closing Hell Gates, The Death of a Convict Station, and American Citizen British Slaves, Yankee Political Prisoners in a Penal Colony. All right. But this particular one, again, this is excellent, excellent work. I'm glad he put this together because he literally gave you the entire picture of the transatlantic slave trade. He gave you the entire picture. Okay? So again, this particular article that he put together, Convict Transportation from Britain and Ireland from 1615 to 1870. And this is by Hamish Maxwell Stewert out of the University of Tasmania. Okay. All right, family. So I hope that you got a pretty good picture of what slavery was all about. So now these are the receipts on what I have been telling you over the years, what slavery really meant. It was a combination of prisoners of war, convicts, and people coming over on indentured servant contracts. So this gentleman, author Maxwell Stewert, laid it all out. He showed you that the transatlantic slave trade was a worldwide thing. This was a worldwide affair. This was not delegated to Africa. This was about the European empires using prison labor, and whether that's prisoners of war or not, as the source of labor for their colonies around the world. And specifically, when we want to talk about the African slave trade and why it is delegated to West Africa, in the case of the Americas, it is because that's where those European empires either had a contractual agreement for trade or a trade agreement with those said West African nations, or they had colonies. And they also took their European convicts over to these West African colonies or where they were doing business, and they had them work in the factories, or if they had military experience, they built the ports. And the English was not the first to do it. As a matter of fact, it was the Portuguese coming up out of West Africa, where they did the same. They sent their convicts over to Africa as well, and then they shipped folks out of North Africa to their other colonies around the world and in South America. Okay? So the transatlantic slave trade was worldwide. Okay? Even the portion that they're telling you about Africa, the official narrative that they're giving you is incorrect. All right? So I hope that this was not confusing, but excellent work by the author, Maxwell Stewert, Hamish Maxwell Stewert, out of Tasmania. Excellent work. Much respect. I will be getting into his other works as well. It is much appreciated. So I want to thank you all, family, on this Monday. This is Rhonda with WTUZ Radio Podcast, and I also want to encourage the family, if you are not subscribed to us, to subscribe, like, and share. And then just as bonus material, I am going to add the pictures of who those earlier European kings and queens and inhabitants were in Europe, just as a reminder. Okay? So wishing everyone well, family. Peace and love.